Hi everyone, today we're going to be discussing the Age of Reason, which spans from 1660 to 1780. This period is also known as the Enlightenment, and it was a major intellectual and literary movement that swept across Europe. The Age of Reason was characterized by rationalism, the idea that reason should be the supreme authority in matters of opinion, belief, and conduct. What's interesting about the English version of this movement is that it gave equal importance to both experience and reason when examining the human condition, which made it less strictly rational than the French or continental Enlightenment. The works we'll be discussing today are Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal and two pieces by Robert Burns, Auld Lang Syne and To a Mouse. These works really showcase the diverse characteristics of Age of Reason literature. Let me start by giving you some historical background. The Age of Reason began in 1660 with a significant political event in England, the Restoration. The Puritan regime was toppled, and King Charles II returned to the throne. This brought massive changes to England. The monarchy was restored, theatres reopened after the Puritans had closed them, and there was generally a spirit of celebration and renewed cultural activity. However, things got complicated pretty quickly. Charles II became Catholic on his deathbed in 1685, which caused major tensions. When his brother James II succeeded him, the situation worsened because James was openly Catholic and tried to restore Catholic privileges. When James' son was born, ensuring a Catholic line of succession, Parliament had enough. This led to the Glorious Revolution of 1688, where James was pushed out and replaced by his Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange. This revolution was relatively bloodless, but established crucial principles. In 1689, Parliament passed the Bill of Rights, which limited the power of the Crown and reaffirmed parliamentary supremacy. In 1702, Queen Anne took the throne, and after her came the Hanoverian kings, George I and George II. During their reigns, the country was effectively ruled by ministers rather than the monarchs themselves. This shift toward constitutional monarchy and away from absolute royal power was very characteristic of Enlightenment political thinking. The period also saw tremendous social and cultural changes. In 1662, the Royal Society was chartered, requiring the use of scientific method in all investigations. London underwent two disasters in rapid succession: the 1665 plague that killed 70,000 people, and the Great Fire of 1666 destroyed 13,000 houses and hundreds of churches. Perhaps one of the most significant changes was economic. The move from agriculture to industry created a massive population shift from country to town. The middle class was growing increasingly powerful, and this had huge implications for literature. Coffee houses started appearing everywhere. By the end of the century, there were several thousands in London alone. They became centers of intellectual discussion and debate. So, how did all these changes affect literature? Well, literature in the Age of Reason moved away from the ornate, passionate styles of earlier periods. Writers favored clarity, order, and restraint. The heroic couple, two rhyming lines in iambic pentameter, became incredibly popular, especially in the hands of masters like John Dryden and Alexander Pope. Satire flourished during this period. Writers used wit and irony to criticize individuals, society, and political issues. The political essay also emerged as a new form. Publications like the Tatler and the Spectator, which were first published by Richard Steele and Joseph Addison, became influential ways to shape public opinion and discuss morals and manners. Here's something crucial. Literature became more middle class oriented with the rise of coffee houses and increased literacy. Writers began addressing a broader audience. They were no longer writing primarily for wealthy patrons. They were writing for the growing reading public. This democratization of literature is really important for understanding the works we are discussing today. Let me start with Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, published in 1729. This essay is often considered the greatest English mock epic and one of the finest examples of satirical prose ever written. It's also probably the most shocking work we are discussing today. Swift's essay proposes, with a completely straight face and seemingly sound economic reasoning, that poor Irish families, should sell their children as food for wealthy English landlords. He even provides calculations about how many children could be sold, what they might cost, and suggestions for recipes. If you don't immediately recognize this as satire, it's deeply disturbing. But that's precisely Swift's genius. He's exposing and ridiculizing the callous attitudes of the English toward the Irish poor and the general dehumanization of impoverished people. Swift was writing during a time of terrible poverty in Ireland. The Irish were being exploited by absentee English landlords, and Swift was outraged by both the suffering of his fellow Irish citizens and the indifference of those in power. What makes this work so representative of the Age of Reason is Swift's use of logical argument and rational discourse to present an utterly irrational and immoral proposal. He's turning Enlightenment rationality against itself, showing how reason without morality or compassion can justify absolute horrors. The prose style is perfect for this purpose: clear, orderly, and methodical. He presents his modest proposal as if it's the most reasonable solution in the world. Using economic data and practical considerations, this deadpan delivery makes the satire even more cutting. Swift's essay also demonstrates how Enlightenment writers engaged with social and political issues. They weren't writing in isolation. They were actively participating in public discourse, trying to influence opinion and policy. Without a doubt, Swift was the finest prose satirist of the Age of Reason. In the hands of Alexander Pope, the heroic couple reached perfection, and prose became less ornate with the introduction of literary periodicals and the political essay. So, that covers the historical period, the literary characteristic, and our first major work. Now, I'll turn it over to my partner to discuss Robert Burns and his contribution to Age of Reason literature.
Thanks. So now we are shifting to Robert Burns, who represents a really interesting and different aspect of the Age of Reason. Burns was born in January 25, 1759 in Alloway, Scotland, and he is known as Scotland's national poet. He died young at just 37 in 1796, but in that short life he created an incredible body of work. Burns' background is crucial to understanding his poetry. He was a tenant farmer who followed his father's example, and unlike many educated poets of his time, Burns experienced firsthand the hardships of agricultural life. He was able to escape the difficulties of the soil in two ways. Toward the end of his life, he became an excise collector in Dumfries, and throughout his life he was a practicing poet. He recorded and celebrated aspects of farm life, regional experience, traditional culture, class culture, and religious practice and belief in such a way that transcended the particularities of his inspiration, becoming finally the national poet of Scotland. What's really important is that Burns wrote in Scots dialect, or what was sometimes dismissively called Scots vernacular. This was a deliberate choice. At a time when English cultural dominance was increasing, especially after the Union of the Crowns in 1603 and the Act of Union in 1707, Burns was asserting the value of Scottish language and culture. He clearly and repeatedly expressed his wish to be called a Scots bard, to extol his native land in poetry and song. Burns is often called a pre-romantic poet because of his sensitivity to nature, his high valuation of feeling and emotion, his spontaneity, his fierce stance for freedom and against authority, his individualism, and his antiquarian interest in old songs and legends. Many backward glances of romantic poets to Burns, as well as critical comments and pilgrimages to the locals of Burns' life and work, suggest the validity of connecting Burns with that pervasive European cultural movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, which credited him with a concern for creating a better world and for cultural renovation. However, Burns was also very much a product of the Enlightenment. He valued reason, opposed religious superstition, and believed in social progress. He is really this fascinating bridge between two literary movements. Let me talk about To a Mouse first. The full title is To a Mouse, on turning her up in her nest with the plow, November 1785. The scenario is beautifully simple and real. Burns is plowing a field when he accidentally destroys a mouse's nest. The poem is his apology and meditation on this event. What is revolutionary here is that Burns treats this tiny creature with genuine empathy and respect. He addresses the mouse as a fellow being, wee, sleeked, cowering, timorous beastie, which translates to small, sleek, cowering, timid little beast. There is a real compassion in these lines. The poem's most famous lines come near the end. The best laid schemes, O mice and men, gan after glee, which means the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry. This has become a universal expression about the unpredictability of life, and it was even used as the title inspiration for John Steinbeck's famous novel Of Mice and Men. But there is more depth here than just that famous quote. Burns makes a profound comparison between the mouse and himself. They are both victims of circumstances. The mouse loses her winter nest, and Burns, as a struggling farmer, knows all about having his plants destroyed by forces beyond his control. What really stands out is when Burns says that the mouse is actually better off than humans, because she lives only in the present. She doesn't torture herself with memories of the past or anxieties about the future. Still thou art blessed compared with me, the present only toucheth thee, but I will backward cast my eye on prospect rear, and forward though I cannot see, I guess and fear. This is very much an enlightenment concern, examining the human condition and what makes us different from other creatures. But Burns approaches it from an unusually empathetic and egalitarian perspective. He is not just philosophizing about abstract concepts, he is finding deep meaning in an everyday encounter with a field mouse. The fact that he wrote this in a Scots dialect is also significant. He is saying that profound poetry doesn't need to be in proper English or follow classical models. Common people, common language, and common experiences are worthy of serious literary treatment. Burns wrote for a local known audience to whom he looked for immediate response, often in a wonderfully appealing conversational style. Now let's discuss Auld Lang Syne, probably Burns' most famous work worldwide, though many people who sing it every New Year's Eve don't realize Burns wrote it. Actually, Burns didn't entirely write it from scratch. He collected, adapted, and perfected a traditional Scottish folk song, which was common practice for him. The title translates roughly to Auld Lang Synes, or Days Gone By. The song is fundamentally about friendship, memory, and the passage of time. The speaker asks whether old acquaintances should be forgotten, and the answer is a resounding no. We should remember old friends and old times and celebrate those connections. The chorus is what most people know. For Auld Lang Syne, my dear. For Auld Lang Syne. We'll take a cup of kindness yet for Auld Lang Syne. In English, that's for old time's sake, my dear. For old time's sake. We'll take a cup of kindness yet for old time's sake. What makes this song so enduring, why it is sung at New Year's celebrations worldwide, is its universal theme. Everyone has experienced the bittersweet feeling of remembering past friendships and wondering about old friends. The song moves from specific memories, running about the hills, picking daisies, paddling in streams, to a more general celebration of enduring friendship despite time and distance. Burns' genius was in capturing something deeply human and expressing it in language. That's both simple and profound. The imagery is concrete and relatable. We twa hae ran about the braes, and pulled the gowans fine. We too have run about the hills, and pulled the daisies fine. These are memories anyone can relate to, which is why the song has such universal appeal. This represents an important aspect of Age of Reason literature, the tension between tradition and innovation, between folk culture and learned literature. Burns bridges these worlds beautifully. He's taking folk material and refining it into literary art, but without losing its connection to the common people and oral tradition. Burns began his career as a local poet, writing for a local known audience. He wrote on topics both to himself and to his artistic constituency, often in a wonderfully appealing conversational style. His humble agricultural background made him in some ways a spokesperson for common people, especially the poor and disenfranchised. He was aware of humanity's unequal condition, and wrote of it and of his desire for a better world of equality throughout his life. So, what can we conclude about the Age of Reason from these three works? First, we have seen that it was a period of tremendous diversity. Swift's savage satire and Barnes' heartfelt poetry might seem worlds apart, but they both reflect Enlightenment values in their own ways. Swift uses reason and logic to critique society's moral failures. He shows how rational discourse can be weaponized for social commentary. Burns, on the other hand, elevates common experiences and common people, arguing that reason alone isn't enough. We need empathy, connection, and respect for all beings. These works also show us that the Age of Reason wasn't emotionally cold or purely intellectual. Yes, it valued clarity and order, but writers were deeply engaged with human feelings, social justice, and moral questions. The period produced both devastating satire and touching poetry about miles and friendship. Perhaps most importantly, literature in this period became more democratic. Whether it was Swift addressing political issues in accessible prose, or Burns writing in Scots dialect for common readers, Age of Reason writers expanded who could participate in literature culture. Literature was no longer just for the wealthy and educated elite. It was becoming a medium for broader public discourse. The Age of Reason, from the Restoration in 1660 through the late 18th century, was a period of massive change, political upheaval, scientific advancement, plague and fire, economic revolution from agriculture to industry, and the rise of the middle class. The literature reflects all this complexity, from the rationalism and satire of Swift to the emotional depth and cultural nationalism of Burns. We see writers grappling with what it means to be human, how society should function, and who deserves to have their voice heard. Although many of the ideas and literary modes of the Age of Reason lasted through the 18th century, by its second half, changes had begun to occur. Burns represents that transition. He is rooted in Enlightenment thinking but already moving toward Romanticism, with his emphasis on emotion, nature, and the common man. That concludes our discussion of the Age of Reason. Thank you for listening.